What's up, skeptics? Welcome to another episode of Reason to Doubt, your source for all things skeptical. I am Jordan, and today I'm joined by Dave from across the pond. How's it going, Dave?
I'm not too bad. How's your good self?
Like we were discussing backstage, in my personal life, things are awesome.
Yeah.
I'm just living out that meme with the dog and the coffees, the room's on fire. This is fine.
Yep. It's all good.
So today I brought Dave on because I've been getting a lot of comments on my Shroud of Turin videos mostly, but other videos, the 9/11 video got a few of them too, where people were basically accusing me of an anti-supernatural bias because I was requiring evidence, what a sin, or people like not seeming to understand what it meant to prefer simpler explanations for things, and other just kind of epistemological confusions. And so I thought, my eyes go cross whenever I have to like articulate epistemology. So I thought I'd bring in an expert.
If it helps, so do mine. So we're in trouble.
So in case people aren't familiar with your channel, Dave, why don't you introduce yourself and explain why people should care what you have to say?
I'm Dave. That's why they should care what I say. I actually have degrees in this stuff.
Real degrees, not like Kent Hovind degrees either.
Exactly. I actually worked hard to get them, and they're with distinction too. So I know a couple of things, and I have a YouTube channel called Trolley Dave where I talk about this kind of stuff.
The channel, which I think I neglected to link in the description, I'll put a link in there after we're done, is awesome and criminally undersubscribed. So if you like my content, you'll very likely enjoy Dave's content. So definitely go over there and check that out. Okay, so let's dive into why we're talking about this, sort of like the impetus to this. And I found a clip that I think really summarizes the I'm going to say things like the Christian position or the theist position. I'm going to say right now up front, this is not all Christians or all theists, this isn't all skeptics or anything either, so if it doesn't apply to you, I'm not talking to you. But anyways,
you have to make it clear.
Right. But there is a feeling that skeptics and atheists have anti-supernatural bias because we tend to require more evidence to believe those sorts of things, right? And we have a cool catchphrase that what's his name?
Carl Sagan.
That's it, Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and this, though it seems super straightforward to me, has caused no end of consternation since it was said. But I have a clip from William Lane Craig that I kind of think summarizes the feeling. So I'm going to play that, and then we can kick it off. And if I was a real professional, I would have queued up this screen sharing before, but I'm not, so I didn't.
Bigger channels have engineers. That's why it looks so seamless for them.
Well, I'm an engineer, so this channel does, in fact, have an engineer.
Different kind of engineer, though.
All right, chat, let me know if this is too loud or too soft, but this is from William Lane Craig. If you're not familiar with him, he's a extremely popular Christian apologist, Dr. Craig.
This commonsensical slogan that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, I think, is demonstrably false. It misunderstands the probability calculus. Events which are extraordinary and therefore highly improbable relative to the background evidence can nevertheless turn out to be highly probable if the evidence on the hypothesis is much more probable than the evidence would be if the hypothesis were false. And so it's just, I think, demonstrably wrong to mouth this slogan that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. You can have ordinary evidence that will be sufficient to establish an extraordinary event. What's key will be the ratio between the probability of the evidence on the hypothesis and the probability of the evidence on the negation of the hypothesis.
So basically what he just said if I could narrow it down, kind of boil it down to its essence, is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Am I crazy?
No, that's right. But he's doing the whole Bayesian theory thing here, isn't he? Like, where if you have all these claims made within some certain hypothesis, and what we're seeing fits all this stuff in this previous hypothesis, then it's more likely to be this hypothesis is true. But most people don't do reasoning like that.
I am a good Bayesian, so that's how I think about it, but I am not most people, I fully admit.
Yeah, but most people just go with, it's kind of like how Hume says, we just have all these experiences in the world, and the more we experience a particular thing, the more we think that thing is true. And when something else goes against our previous experiences, then it can seem extraordinary, and we need evidence that's of the same level or greater than our experiences to overcome some kind of claim that we see as extraordinary.
Well, let's talk about the terms that we're throwing around that might seem obvious, but it's always a good idea to establish the meaning of very important terms. So you've said you need evidence to believe this, and William Craig concurs. He just disputes like what kind or whatever. But what is evidence? What makes something evidence?
Have you ever heard of a philosopher called Joshua Rasmussen?
Yes.
Yeah, he's a theist, but he's a really good and fair philosopher. And he has a saying that I really like: evidence is something that makes something else evident. It's like really simplistic, but basically evidence is anything that raises the likelihood of something being true.
So
it's pretty simple.
Any sort of observation or something where seeing that means the other thing is more likely than it would have been had you not seen it.
Yeah, basically. If say testimony, it's a good example. If you know somebody who says they saw this really weird bird in the park and you don't know them, that doesn't kind of raise the chance that it's true for you. But if it's a close friend who you trust, then it becomes evidence because it raises the probability that it's true. And that's basically what evidence is generally seen as in philosophy and even in science. Evidence is just something that links some claim to some conclusion and makes the conclusion seem more true.
So another thing I often see in my comments are people saying that XYZ isn't evidence. This one more often comes from atheists or skeptics, or self-proclaimed skeptics at least. This argument or this thing doesn't count as evidence because it doesn't prove that it's true. Like that thing doesn't get you all the way there. But that's not what you're saying. Is that's not necessarily necessary as long as it makes it more likely than it otherwise would have been.
Yeah, and another one that I see people get wrong as well is evidence can only point to one conclusion. If it points to multiple conclusions, then it's not evidence. But that's not true because a piece of data can be evidence for multiple conclusions. It just doesn't narrow it down, but it still raises the chance that those conclusions and claims are true.
Right. I think where they might be confused there is if something doesn't differentiate between like any different hypothesis, then it isn't helpful. But like if I said if there's an object, you can't see it, and I give you a piece of information about the object's red. Well, that could be a lot of things, but it's probably not a lime, right? So now it's evidence against like it's not a lime, and it's evidence for it being a certain kind of apple or a fire truck or whatever,
Yeah. I mean, there's a thought experiment in philosophy, the all ravens are black thought experiment. And it's basically, it kind of shows the weird nature of evidence where any raven that's black is evidence for the claim that all ravens are black. But anything that's not a raven, and okay, I'm trying to remember how this goes now, but anything that's not a raven will be black still. It counts towards
doesn't
it
black.
Yeah, that's it. It's there can be evidence that kind of raises something as being true, but it's not particularly useful evidence. So it's just all about raising the probability that some claim is true.
Jared, who some of you may know slightly, asks, since extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, do bad claims require bad evidence? I think they
Yes.
often get bad evidence.
Yep. And I mean, a bad claim, if you can't have good evidence for a bad claim, really, because if it's a bad claim and it's not true, all the evidence will just point towards it being a bad claim. It can raise it as
false
being
claims
true.
False claims will often have some evidence.
Some evidence, yeah. It just never quite pushes it high enough where we should accept it.
Well, that's a good segue to the next point. So we've established what evidence is. Is anything? One more question. Would you agree that arguments can be evidence?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because they can raise the idea that something is true. And they're often needed to link some physical piece of data to the actual thing. You can't just hold up a rock and say, that's evidence. You need some kind of argument to link it to what it's evidence for.
Scott Duke says that I've convinced him, I've given him evidence that a bow tie should have been part of the standard Starfleet uniform. I think that a bow tie should be a part of every uniform, just everyday life. Just if any outfit will be enhanced. Just throwing on a bow tie. Okay, so you talked about evidence needing to overcome something to rise to the level that you should believe it. So what is it that is overcoming? Why should we expect more evidence for some claims rather than others? Like, is this a bias thing or what's going on?
Yes and no. This goes back to kind of what I was saying, and this kind of comes from David Hume. The more we see something happen, the more likely we are to think that it is the case. Like take gravity, for example. If you drop something, it falls to the ground, and it does it all the time. It never fails to not do that. And so if somebody came up to you and said, I dropped a ball and it went upwards, that would take some good evidence to convince you that it happened, because you have never, ever experienced something like that in your life. Or say you've only ever heard dogs bark. Somebody came up to you and said, my dog spoke to me the other day and asked me for a cup of tea. That's going to take some pretty good evidence to overcome your previous experiences. But now if you were to say somebody on the ISS dropped a ball and it floated upwards, it's gonna be slightly different. You don't need the you don't need the extra evidence to overcome that, because you have experience of a ball just floating around outside of gravity. So that's the kind of bias that it needs to overcome, the evidence, if that makes sense.
Right. In Bayesian thinking, we call this the prior probability.
The prior probabilities, yeah.
Yeah. And so the idea is that every hypothesis has some kind of prior probability, which is just the probability that we would expect prior to knowing whatever it is we're examining, just from our background knowledge. And this often gets confused with bias in like the negative or pejorative sense. But it's not that you're biased, except in the sense that just the evidence you have leads you to certain conclusions, but that's just thinking. Like I have, like it's not bias for me to say that I have good evidence for, I don't know, my car being in my driveway. Like that's not bias. I just have I have reason to think.
You've got a car there, yeah.
Right. So if something has a low prior probability, it's unlikely, or we have reason to think it was unlikely. But as William Lane Craig said, that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means you need more evidence to raise that prior probability above 50%, or raise that posterior probability.
Yeah. And that's that's one of the things about being human is evidence and past experiences and what we'll accept as true. There's a whole psychological element to it. Like everybody seems to think that we are these reasoning machines, but most of us, like I'll put my hand up as well, most of us just aren't very good at reasoning. We're induction machines, basically. We learn through experience, and when things go against our experience, we tend to dismiss it, especially when it's an experience we've had plenty of times. If we've only experienced something a couple of times, we're more likely to accept it may be something different. Yeah.
So where the bias is coming in is not in prior probability of requiring more evidence. I think it's in not accepting evidence that goes against what you would like to be true. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not in the prior part, it's in the posterior part. And sorry, I'm using these terms. Prior is before you look at the evidence. Posterior is you've baked in the evidence, and now what do you think?
Yeah.
The bias comes in just not letting that new evidence in, or rejecting it, or some way not assessing it appropriately.
Yeah. And I mean, people accusing atheists of having an anti-supernatural bias, it's not so much an anti-supernatural bias, it's that how many people have ever experienced the supernatural. I mean, maybe there are, but most of us have never experienced it. And when we have experienced somebody claiming to have experienced it, pretty much every time it turns out to be some kind of trickery or mistaken. And we all know that humans aren't very good at interpreting things that happen, our own biases. So you could argue that it's the theists with a supernatural bias. None of them have ever had it. None of them have ever experienced it, but they want it to be true. So they look for ways to make it true.
That's a great point. When they're accusing Mike Licona does this.
Yeah.
And even though I like his work, even though I disagree with him greatly. He seems like he's genuinely trying to be honest. But he talks about how with the resurrection of Jesus is what he's most focused on. And he basically says, if you don't allow all these hypotheses to basically start at a level playing field, that's a bias. But I think you're right in that putting the supernatural on a level playing field with natural explanations is itself biased. Because it shouldn't be, regardless of what else is true. Even if the supernatural is true, it's something like miracles happen rarely, even if they do happen. And so the idea that we should just give it even odds because it's fair, like
it just that kind of thing just doesn't work. And I know you could make an argument here like, well, if God is true, then God could raise some person from the dead. But if you don't believe in God, that doesn't really count as part of the prior probability.
You can't put hypotheses in your prior. The prior is the good evidence you have up to now. So if you want to use God as evidence, you're going to have to convince me of that. And then Jared brings up a good point. He says people don't often understand that priors can be unique to the individual. So a theist might require less evidence for a thing than an atheist.
That's absolutely true. Right. That's why I was saying that, that there's a whole psychological thesis that goes on when it comes to accepting evidence, what counts as evidence, or epistemological framework, all that counts. And it can all be kind of subjective.
Who was it? Was it Thomas Paine who said that divine revelation is revelation for the first person only, for everyone else it's hearsay?
It's hearsay, yeah.
Yeah. And that's like people will often invoke things like their own personal subjective experience and like that's evidence. And I will say for you, the one having the experience, sure, right?
Yeah.
That could potentially be extremely strong evidence for you, but that doesn't help me out at all. Like that when someone tells me I had this experience of this feeling or whatever, I don't have access to that experience. So the only thing you've told me is a person has an experience they've interpreted a certain way, but people have experiences that lead them to wrong conclusions all the time.
I do it. Yep.
Yeah. So, that doesn't help me at all.
And this is where something like testimony can come in, and it sort of shows you how the subjective nature of evidence can be, in that if somebody I know was to tell me, if like you were to turn to me now and say, I had this really incredible experience last night, it was a religious experience, I saw Jesus come to me in my living room or something, I would be more likely to use that in a more positive way, because I trust you, I know you. But if somebody like Trump said it, you'd be like, yeah, you're just pandering to your audience.
Well,
that's not evidence.
If Trump said it, that is now evidence of the opposite, so far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Basically, it really is, because you know that he's playing to a particular audience, and it fits better into that framework as evidence of that.
To kind of sum up to this point, and lead into how much evidence we should need, the example I've tried to give for people to try to explain why it's not a bias, why you should need more evidence for certain claims. I said, imagine I told you that I had breakfast this morning. Now, that's not true, because I don't usually eat breakfast. So if you knew me, that might be unlikely. Imagine I did, or you don't know me very well, that's not a very extravagant claim. People at breakfast. The mere fact that I told you I had breakfast, probably good enough for you to reasonably believe it. Yeah. But if I then said, oh, no, I missed, I said I had breakfast, but I had breakfast with the president. Well, that's a much bigger claim. Like, you would, if you don't know me, particularly if you don't trust me, you might require reasonably some more evidence. That's a thing that doesn't happen as often, but it can happen. People do have breakfast with the president occasionally, right?
Yeah.
So maybe like a news clipping or something would be enough. But then if I said, no, not the current president. I had breakfast with President George Washington, the first president of the United States, and I had it this morning. Well, now the amount of evidence you would need would be massive. Dare I say, extraordinary.
Yeah. It's like, if somebody told you that they were playing handball on the ISS, a regular person on the street, you'd be like, yeah, okay, enjoy your trip down the pub.
Right.
But if it was an astronaut, you'd be like, oh, I know you were on the ISS. Oh, how was it? All that makes a difference to how you accept that evidence.
Okay, so how do we go about making that assessment in a way that prevents us from putting in our bias? Because if we're like developing these priors, and again, we're not computers, so you don't like go through this complex number crunching and come up with an exact number. But some kind of fuzzy prior probability people have. That seems like a process that would be ripe for bias if you're going to inject any into the process. So how can we avoid doing that?
I think that's actually kind of difficult, because it's just part and parcel of being human. But the best way to do it would be in some kind of Cartesian sense, in that if you look at why you're accepting it, how you got to that conclusion, you can start looking at the reasons why you think that is true, and going through, well, does this evidence actually connect to this, or am I just wanting it to be true? And where did you get that information from? Have you clarified that information, or did you just accept it because somebody you know said it? There's just so much that goes into it, but as long as you make sure that you're getting it from reasonable sources, you're not accepting it because it's something you really want to be true, those are sort of the best ways to go about it.
Jared says, step one, beware, be afraid of the fact that you're human and have bias. Yeah, I think the way that I go about it when I'm running this channel or looking into various claims is I try to figure out, to start with, if I have a bias, to the extent I have one, which conclusion am I naturally inclined to believe, right?
Yeah.
And then I will start by looking for evidence against that conclusion. So the first thing I look at, ideally, are people in favor of the thing I'm debunking or whatever. So that, one, I don't inadvertently miss something by not looking for for it, but also because there's another bias that people have, like an anchoring bias, where the first thing you see is like your brain says, okay, that's the standard, and then like judges everything else based on that. So I try to like use that bias to fight the other bias.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all these are baked into our brain. That's one of the problems. They're all kind of baked into how we think, simply because of how our brains have evolved to navigate the world.
Digital Notice says, in the bias literature, being aware of biases and that you have them actually doesn't help you avoid them much. I would say that the mere fact that you are aware of them won't help if you don't take any actions based on that knowledge. But in order to take actions to avoid bias being introduced, you have to be aware of them, right? And we have like the entire scientific process is in part exists to help combat human biases by removing human ideas as much as possible from the data collection and things like that.
Yeah, I think to some degree as well, knowing that you have these biases can actually be kind of a hindrance to getting rid of them. Because if you think about like a lot of the things that you see in the skeptic community, well, I'm a skeptic, therefore I don't accept anything without evidence. And then they go around accepting whatever just sounds really good to them.
Yeah. I'm a skeptic. By definition, everything I believe must be reasonable and logical.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you try to convince them that they've accepted this thing without evidence, many of them will go, well, no, I'm a skeptic. I don't accept things without. Yeah, but here's an example of you doing it. Yeah, but I'm a skeptic, so I wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
So I think knowing it can be sort of harmful to getting rid of them sometimes. It depends on how seriously you take it, I guess.
Going back to the supernatural thing we were talking about, Scott Duke asked, don't supernatural claims have to get out from under the weight of these two axioms? One, people lie and often unknowingly spread lies, and two, people misinterpret their sense data constantly. So I think this is touching on testimony as a form of evidence. And whenever you're looking at a piece of evidence or some kind of observation, you should try to imagine the different ways, different explanations for the thing you're looking at. So if someone tells you I saw a thing, one explanation is that they saw the thing. Another explanation is they believe they saw the thing, but it actually didn't correspond to reality.
Yeah.
Which is not like everyone, I think, has had the experience of thinking they saw something and it not being real. For example, when I was in the military, we were on an exercise that had been going. I hadn't slept in a couple days, and it was the middle of the night, and it was raining and everything, and I was like going through the woods to check on one of my guys, and I saw a person step out from behind a tree and point a muzzle loading like Civil War rifle at me, and I looked at it and I said, that's not real, and I just kept going, but my eyes said it was there.
Yeah. I mean, you see it all the time, don't you? It's like people going into haunted houses. They'll say, oh, I heard all these weird noises and I saw this and I saw that. And then nobody else actually saw it. So just the whole atmosphere of it can bring about some kind of experience that you're hoping to see. So we can even trick ourselves sometimes.
Yeah, if your brain is primed to see something, it's likely to see it. If you go out looking for something, if you're looking for a particular conclusion, you are likely to find it.
Yeah. Especially if you really want it to be true.
Right. So to sum up, the statement, do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? What it is saying basically is that a claim requires evidence in proportion to how unlikely it is to be true.
In your experiences too, that plays a big part to it. Yeah.
That's true. Like, for example, the claim that when objects move quickly, very quickly, they become shorter, right, in the direction of travel. And that is a claim that I believe because I have extremely good evidence that it is true. However, go back 400 years, that claim would be bonkers to believe, right? Crazy.
Yeah.
You know, it would be completely unreasonable to believe it, even though it's true.
Yeah. I mean, go back far enough and tell people that we all evolved from, you know, simpler species. They'd be like, what are you talking about? What kind of evidence could ever prove that to somebody 500 years ago?
Okay, so we've dealt with the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence thing. What are some common pitfalls that we haven't maybe touched on that you see people, particularly people in the skeptical community, falling into that we can warn them against?
Well, one is basically what we just mentioned, where they have this bias that just because they're a skeptic, it means that they don't accept things based on no evidence. And they'll a good example of this is, say, Tim O'Neill. He'll jump into a thread on Blue Sky. I think he might still be on Twitter. And he'll call out some bad claim made by a skeptic, and they'll immediately judge him as being just a crypto theist trying to defend something. Yeah. And even when he presents them with evidence, it's like, well, no, you're just a crypto theist.
I've been accused many times of secretly being a theist somehow in the employ of whomever. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, my whole history of my channel apparently isn't good enough as evidence because I've said something that goes against the popular.
Deep undercover.
yeah. So deep, even I haven't realized it yet.
Yeah. You're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness.
Yes.
Something I see happen is people not understanding what the role of authority is when it comes to evidence. So sometimes I'll cite a paper. I'll say, well, here's your evidence. Like, that's just an argument from authority. You're just saying, oh, because this expert thinks it, that's true. It's like, well, it's so, and what they're pointing at is the argument from authority fallacy, but it's not fallacious to rely on the expertise of experts in the fields in which they are experts, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's the whole purpose of experts. They spend a long time studying this stuff and knowing more than you. I mean, you don't go to your plumber to get your teeth fixed.
Exactly.
Unless you're a bit daft.
I think going back to the definition of evidence, if take climate change, for example, virtually every scientist who specializes in that topic thinks that human-caused climate change is real, right?
Yeah.
And we have certain predictions. And you, the person who thinks they're wrong, who has no particular expertise, you think they're incorrect. Which one is more likely? If it were true, would every expert thinking it, is that more likely because it's true, or is it more likely that they're all false? Like which if human caused climate change was false, would we expect every single expert to think so?
We would if they're all paid by George Soros.
Right. Now, critically, that is not to say, and this is where creationists tend to enter the chat. They'll say, oh, well, science has been wrong in the past, so how can you believe it? Right.
Yeah.
Which is another problem, but the mistake I think they make there is that while science is wrong, it gets less wrong over time, is the idea. Yeah. It's like self-correcting. And so, yes, it's a virtual certainty that all the particulars that we think now are not true. But the overall, it's like we have a camera focused at a painting and it's slowly becoming more focused, right?
Yeah.
Like, we might be wrong when it's fuzzy as to like, oh, that's an apple, and we focus a little bit. Nope, that's actually a ball. But it was still like, it went from something indeterminate to a red object to now it's a much more specific red object,
Yeah. And that's basically how we kind of do with everything, that we just gather more and more information about some particular claim until it becomes more and more apparently true, I guess, for want of a better word.
Digital Gnosis says, if climatologists can predict the climate accurately, then why don't they predict the stock market? Or
if you're so smart.
Right. Or the one you often hear is, well, they can't predict what the weather will be next week. Therefore, how could they know what it'll be like in 20 years? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a big difference between predicting trends and predicting an exact moment.
Exactly. Okay, well, I think we've covered this pretty well. Is there any other piece of epistemology that we've missed? Is there another framework that we should be using rather than... I personally think everyone would be better off if they were just good Bayesians like me, but...
Yeah, I think everybody would just be better off if they didn't believe anything and they were Peronian.
Well, that's another thing that often gets thrown out is... some people say I don't have beliefs. Like you get this sometimes in the skeptic community. I don't believe this. I know it. You know.
Yeah, that's something that people really need in the skeptic community really need to stop doing, and that's a good example of how bias and desire to be seen a certain way can affect the kind of information that we will accept, because I've shown people, you know, this is what a belief is. A belief is just any kind of proposition that we accept as true. And they'll be like, well, no, I know I don't have any beliefs, so that must be wrong. So, well,
do you believe that you don't have beliefs? Because
yeah. And it's sometimes how we desire to be seen can affect the kind of information that we accept. And
social desirability bias.
Yeah.
Digital Gnosis cries and says Bayes is a tool, not a golden hammer. I use Bayes theorem all the time at work because I do probabilistic risk assessment. So like we do Bayes stuff all the time. But I think in the skeptic community, particularly, it's often used for like Jesus mythicists because Richard Carrier is all about Bayes theorem. But the apologist bros will also use it because William Lane Craig uses it sometimes. And I think what happens is people, they see math and they think, oh, I used math, therefore it's objective. Yeah. But all Bayes theorem will do, so for people who aren't familiar, Bayes was a guy long time ago, came up with some methodology to update your beliefs based on new evidence in kind of a rigorous and methodological, like a specific way, right? So when you're using it to assess evidence for like a miracle claim or whatever, it is sort of turning into numbers your own subjective beliefs, which can be useful because it can maybe catch you out thinking like if you judge this piece of evidence to be strong and this piece of evidence to be this strength, and this piece of evidence, and you put them together, it's like, that's telling me a conclusion that I wasn't intuitively thinking. Was there something... Did I mess up somewhere? Is there some piece of evidence I'm valuing too highly? Like, can help you ask those questions. But all you've done is put numbers to your subjectivity. It doesn't make it any less subjective. It's just changing the format of your subjectivity.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I don't really have anything to add to that. You put it really well.
Don Giovanni says, I think the no beliefs claim comes from lack of education and philosophy. It is interesting that a great many people in the new atheist, skeptic Twitter sphere will have this like disdain for philosophy and this kind of like oh, I wouldn't engage in philosophy. And then they'll proceed to engage in philosophy just without knowing anything about it, you know?
Yeah. I think there's also, it's not just... a lack of education in philosophy, it's an in-group, out-group kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like a Christian, Christians are like, those people over there are the bad people, we're the moral ones because we're Christian. And you get a lot of these sort of new atheist group. We're the rational ones. They're the irrational ones. They hold beliefs, therefore it's irrational to hold beliefs. I'm rational, therefore I hold no beliefs. And it's more about assigning ourselves to particular groups and kind of assigning weight to how great your in-group is and how terrible the out-group is.
Well, if they were so good, I'd be part of that group. So
yeah. If somebody wants you in the group, it's a terrible group.
Okay. So to summarize everything we've talked about, extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence. And by extraordinary, we just mean the claim is unlikely based on our experience up to this point, and therefore the evidence needs to be large in strength or magnitude in order to overcome that.
Overcome our own experiences,
Right. So we can
especially
update our
especially when it's an experience that we have all the time and it's never failed to happen. The more that experience fails to happen, the more like the lower the strength of the evidence will need to be to overcome it.
Evidence can be anything, an observation, an argument, a scientific paper you see, whatever, that makes the thing you're looking at more likely than it would be if that weren't the case. So a piece of evidence or an argument doesn't need to get you 100% of the way all by itself to count as evidence, and something that is false can still have evidence. It just won't have enough evidence to overcome the unlikely nature of the
unlikely.
And
that's the way I see it anyway.
Contrary to what Michael Kona and William Lane Craig and some other people have said, it is not an anti-supernatural bias to require a great deal of evidence to believe in the supernatural. It is, in fact, a bias to not do that. At least for someone who doesn't have good reason to already believe in it. If you already have good reason, so that's part of your prior probability, then the situation is different for you. Okay. Well, before we head out, Dave, do you have anything coming up on your channel that people should be aware of, that they should check out?
No, my channel's lay dormant since uni started again because I'm not very good at computer science and it takes up all my time to actually just get average marks. So,
see, that's why I've started doing live streams like this, because then I don't have to edit anything, so it's way easier. Well, definitely people should check out your channel too. And I think I'll put your social media links and everything in the description. I failed to do it before. They'll be in there shortly. But thanks so much for coming on. It's always nice talking to you.
No, thank you for having me on. It's been great catching up with you. And I hope your country starts to get more back to normal soon.
I don't think that'll happen. I would need a great deal of evidence to believe that.
Like I say, move to Wales. We'd love to have you here.
For this channel, what we've got coming up in 2 weeks. I have the date. I don't remember it offhand, but it's in 2 weeks. I will be talking to Dr. Dan of Creation Myths, and we will be talking about transgender people, the biological evidence for that being a real thing that really happens, beyond the fact that, look, there's one, you can just go see them, and why the vitriol and the things that are coming out, particularly in the skeptic community, are basically denying science, despite their many objections to the contrary. So subscribe if you want to see that. But until then, remember, you've always got reason to doubt.